International Giving for the David Weekley Family Foundation. In my previous career, I was a newspaper reporter, and I think that's why Fred knew I would get a kick out of introducing today's speaker, Michael Cromartie, one of the nation's leading experts on bridging the Christian community and mainstream media. Michael is the Vice President of Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he directs two programs on evangelicals in civic life and religion and the media. In 2004, Michael was appointed by President Bush to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also senior advisor to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum. He also finds time to teach at the Reformed Theological Seminary and serve as an advisory editor at Christianity Today. He was an advisor to the PBS documentary series With God on Our Side, The Rise of the Christian Right in America. He is the editor of 10 books, including Piety and Politics, Evangelicals and Fundamentalists Confront the World. Michael's presentation today centers on his work with the Religion and the Media program, which seeks to strengthen the impact of the religious conviction and religiously grounded argument in American politics and public life. The core of this program is a semi-annual conference that brings together top journalists and scholars in a discussion about religion and politics. Michael has been able to recruit journalists from some of the most influential news outlets in America, including the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC, and NPR, Time, Newsweek, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. Journalists who attend these events get a chance to step away from the cauldron of the newsroom and the pressures of the daily deadline, to learn, think, discuss, and deepen their understanding of the role of and impact on religion on our society, and to report on this critical subject. Here with us today to share his insights is Michael Cromartie.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd kind of like to use your comments and make them my own because you explained it so well. But I will take it a little further. I'm supposed to announce to you that their CDs are available on site within an hour at the Dove sales booth of this talk. So within an hour, you can hear it again if you like. I need to let you know that this Red God, Blue God, I'm not in this talk going to be making any partisan comments, unless during the Q&A you ask me a highly partisan question and I try to give a nuanced answer. So I just want to assure the 2 or 3 Democrats in the audience that this is not going to be a partisan talk. It's important for me to say that. You need to know that before the primaries, there was a lunch. 2 senators had lunch in Washington, one a Republican, one a Democrat. And it was, right leading up to the primaries, before Senator Obama was a candidate, before Senator McCain was a candidate, and they were having lunch, and the Republican said to the Democratic senator, the problem with you and your party is that you don't understand religion. You don't understand religious people. You don't understand religion. In fact, he said, I want to tell you something. I bet you $20 that you can't even recite the Lord's Prayer. And the Democrat said, well, I can do that. Of course I can. He said, let's bow our heads. And then he said, now I lay me down to sleep. The Republican pulled out $20 and said, I didn't think you could do it. We have a problem on all sides on this question. Because of the conference that I'm about to tell you about that I run, I've got to know a lot of journalists and a lot of people in the media. And you'd want to know, for instance, just to give you an example, and I'm going to give you several. Last week, I had a phone call from 2 very prominent journalists, one from Newsweek magazine and the other from National Public Radio. And one from Newsweek said, he left a message, call me right back, Michael. I need to talk to you. I'm on deadline. I called her back, and she said, well, you heard the news. I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, the governor's daughter is pregnant. I said, oh, of course, I know that. She said, well, there it goes. It's over, isn't it? I said, I'm sorry? It's over. Evangelical support for the ticket is gone. I said, Lisa, excuse me. You're confusing 1950s fundamentalism with 1990s 2000 evangelicalism. She said, well, don't you think it's just dissipated? It's gone now. I said, no, in fact, it's increased. The fact that the senator did not make the daughter's pregnancy disqualifying has caused their view of him to elevate. She said, are you serious? I said, absolutely. And so we talked about it. An hour later, a phone call from National Public Radio. Well, it's over, isn't it? I couldn't believe it. I said, well, no, it's not, actually. Those are two examples of why our American mainstream media simply do not understand, not just evangelicals, but religious people in general. And that's the purpose of my title. Let me explain the title, Red God, Blue God. You can put those under my seat. Yes, please help yourself. As many of you all know, much has been made of the red and blue two-color maps in the 2000-2004 presidential elections. And the two-color versions, big blocks of red donating states that voted for President Bush stretched across the heartland, while the blue states that went for Vice President Gore and Senator Kerry were concentrated along the east and west coast. This polarity, however, extends not only in our voting behavior, in our politics, but in fact, people in the heartlands and people on the coast inhabit two separate worlds. And they have totally divergent social and religious worlds that they inhabit. Hardly a day goes by without us being reminded by academics and pundits that our society is divided, that we're split, we're fractured. We are, as some said, involved in a culture war. And we are, in fact, according to the eminent historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, we are one nation and two cultures. She wrote a book called One Nation, Two Cultures. We are, according to the political columnist Michael Barone, we are hard America and soft America. We are, according to the New York Times columnist David Brooks, bobos and patio men. Bobos means bourgeois bohemians. People who got their values in the counterculture of the 60s, made money in the 80s, and now they're what Brooks calls bobos, bourgeois bohemians. We are bobos and patio men. We live in latte towns and sprinkler towns. We are on the left coast, and we are in the flyover country. We are red America and blue America. Now, it's important to remember that people in blue America, according to the lyrics of the singer-songwriter Chuck Brodsky, people in blue America like to watch ducks and feed them, while people in red America like to shoot ducks and eat them. Now, somebody knows the song over here. It's the first time I've told that story and somebody gave the line before I finished. Writing in Atlantic Monthly magazine about this two-colored map of our voting patterns, David Brooks observed that people in blue America like to sip lattes and drink champagne, while people in red America like to down sodas and drink brewskis. But most importantly, Brooks argues that the divide is best understood as one of almost completely divergent mental, intellectual, and religious sensibilities. Oftentimes, don't you feel that we live on separate planets with some people? Here's Brooks' very perceptive observation. Those of us in the coastal metro blue areas read more books and attend more plays than people in the red heartland. But don't ask us, please, what life in red America is like. We don't know. We don't know who Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins are, even though the novels they have co-written have sold about 40 million copies over the past few years. We don't know what James Dobson says on his radio program, which is listened to by tens of millions. We don't know what happens in mega churches on Wednesday evenings, and some of us couldn't tell you the difference between a fundamentalist and an evangelical, let alone describe what it means to be a Pentecostal. In fact, end of quote. In fact, David likes to say, and I've heard him say it at some of our conferences, if you went to the New York Times newsroom and asked anybody in there, what is a Pentecostal? He said no one would know, except the cleaning people that clean up at night who attend Pentecostal churches. Now, why is this? The most perceptive sociologist of religion in America today is a man named Peter Berger at Boston University. Professor Berger has made the following observation about America. He says that the most religious country in all the world, qua any kind of religion, is India. The most secular country in the world is Sweden. America is a country of Indians ruled by Swedes. America is a country of Indians ruled by Swedes. Now, what Dr. Berger is suggesting is that those who are the gatekeepers of our society, those who command our educational and cultural leadership positions in our society, what some political scientists have called the new class elites, namely the editors of our major newspapers, the editors and publishers of our major news magazines, the producers of all of our major television networks, the leaders of our major universities, the Hollywood studio and movie producers, all of these people at the cultural street corners of our society. The messages conveyed by these cultural and communication elites is simply not recognized by millions and millions and millions of Americans who call themselves religious. And as you may have noticed, even recently, this divide is most noticed in the way our national media covers religious topics and religious believers. Survey research confirms what Professor Burgers has said about this divide in our culture, but I have anecdotal evidence to support it. In the late 1980s, when Christian conservatives were beginning to have enormous clout in the outcome of our national elections, a political reporter from the New Republic magazine came by to see me and said he wanted to talk about, this was in the late 80s, about the election and about American Protestantism. As many of you know, the New Republic magazine is one of the most important intellectual, liberal weekly magazines of opinion in America. And this man is a person who is an experienced political writer, who is also the author of numerous books on American history and American politics. He was writing a cover story on the rise of conservative Christian involvement in politics. He wanted to talk about the differences between evangelicals, fundamentalists, and charismatic Christians. We talked about 90 minutes about the similarities and the difference between various conservative Protestants. And by the way, you understand what the difference between an evangelical and fundamentalist is, I hope. I like what the historian Grant Wacker says. An evangelical is somebody who really, really, really likes Billy Graham. A fundamentalist is someone who thinks Billy Graham is a liberal. Anyway, we talked about these various brands of American Protestantism. And we finished about an hour of this. He took his pen, he closed it up, and he said, let's cut to the real issue here. I said, okay. These people are sexually repressed, aren't they? I said, John, they all have 6 children. I said, they got over their Platonic view of the body about 50 years ago. The best-selling books in the evangelical community are books on marriage and sexuality and how to have a happy marriage. I said, in fact, John, did you not just see the study that came out from the University of Chicago? A 700-page book called Sex in America. It was just written about in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago, John, where in the second paragraph they said the researchers found that empirically the people who have the most satisfying marriage relationship are evangelical Protestants. True. Now, when I speak to liberal Protestant groups, I don't say, that's not the perfect reason to come over to become an evangelical Protestant. But if it works apologetically for you, I can show you the data. This was not the answer that John wanted to hear, but it was very telling that a political reporter of his experience and his intelligence would want to still believe such a caricature. About 8 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention received national press attention when one summer 8 years ago they sought to explain their understanding of what the proper relationship of husbands and wives should be. And as you will remember, their position received a lot of national attention in the press about the whole relationship to the male and female in marriage. And a writer from the New York Times called me, and she wanted to know if I could help her understand this issue a little bit better. She was writing about it. What is this all about, she said. So we talked for about 20 minutes, and at one point I made a reference to the Apostle Paul's letter in the New Testament to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 23 and following. I said, in chapter 5 of Ephesians, and she interrupted me. She said, what's that book you just mentioned? I said, Ephesians. She said, who's the author? Who's the publisher? I said, it's Ephesians. The author is a man named Apostle Paul. And I realized that I was talking to someone who, you just can't just say, well, in Ephesians, it says 5 and what they're trying to do. I had to start over again. I said, well, there's a book called the Bible, and there's a New Testament, and then there are these letters, and then those letters. You had to start all over again. And I thought, isn't that interesting? This is a very smart reporter at the New York Times saying, what's that book? Obviously, these examples point to a certain lack of knowledge about basic religious issues among members of the Fourth Estate. The eminent American religious historian Martin Marty has asked this question. He said, "Is there any non-religious news in the news today? Any non-religious news in the news today?" Think about it. Almost everywhere we look, religious beliefs, religious conduct, religious conflict play a major part of all the news stories we watch and read about in our world today. More and more journalists today are covering domestic and international political issues that have, in one way or the other, a strong religious component. Now, it is true that the demanding pace of the news gathering business does not invite reflection, much less theological sophistication. And I know that these journalists are on deadlines and they have to write and work in a hurry. These kinds of pressures do not enable journalists to develop even a minimal theological understanding of the role personal faith plays in people's lives or the implications that faith might have in their views of politics or culture. As religiously grounded moral arguments become even more influential in our national debates, particularly reinforced by debates about Islam and terrorism, bioethical issues, or even just war theory and its real-world implications today, the ignorance of journalists about theological convictions has at times distorted public discourse on very important policy issues. Issues like the use of religious rhetoric during campaign speeches require political journalists in print and broadcast media to cover religious contexts that many are ill-equipped to understand. But it is urgent that they understand and important that they learn to do so. It is imperative that journalists raise the level of their reporting by increasing their understanding of religion, religious communities, and religious convictions that inform the political activity of millions of devout believers. But as each of us knows all too well, many journalists are simply not trained to do this. Why is this? Well, again, as I suggested earlier, many of the reasons can be explained by the fact that many journalists and devout religious people inhabit two separate worlds. Different cultures, different worlds, different frameworks of looking at life and reality. I would again call your attention to the observations in a very good book by the eminent historian Gertrude Himmelfarb in her book, One Nation, Two Cultures. She said, "We are simply a nation divided by two cultures." She argues that one side of the culture originated in our conservative Puritan heritage, and the other culture grew out of the counterculture of the 1960s. This latter culture generated what she calls the current dominant culture of today that is represented in media and television and Hollywood films in our major universities in America. The traditionalist culture, what she calls the traditionalist culture, she calls the current dissident culture. She says the new counterculture are people who believe in traditional values. That's the new counterculture. So those of us who were part of the counterculture in the 60s and now got over it, and now we're part of the traditionalist culture, we're a part of the counterculture again. I like that. The traditionalist culture, the dissonant culture, continues to promote the values of family, religion, and traditional sexual morality. She further observes, and I quote, "As a minority, the traditionalist culture," again, I think that's us, "the traditionalist culture labors under the disadvantage of being perennially on the defensive. Its elite, gospel preachers, radio talk show hosts, some prominent journalists, and organizational leaders cannot begin to match in numbers or influence those who occupy the commanding heights of the dominant culture. Professors presiding over the multitude of young people who attend their lectures, read their books, and have to pass their exams. Journalists who determine what information and what spins on that information come to the public. Television and movie producers who provide the images and values that shape the popular culture. Cultural entrepreneurs who are ingenious in creating and marketing ever more sensational and provocative products. An occasional boycott by religious conservatives can hardly counteract the cumulative, pervasive effect of the dominant culture." End of quote. Now, what can we make of all this? And can anything be done about it? Is there anything we can do to bring these two worlds together, especially the journalists who cover these worlds, so that some level of understanding might be achieved? Is there any way, any part of this dominant culture can be changed or at least brought into dialogue with the worlds they, in their more candid moment, simply do not understand? And some of them admit it. Well, almost 10 years ago, an idea occurred to me. Would it be possible to host conferences with some of the country's best scholars on religion and bring them together with some of the most influential journalists in America? What might we be able to do to increase understanding of religion and religious believers if we hosted a 2-day conference with the top political and print and broadcast reporters to meet with some of the best thinkers in the world? Well, working with the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, this is what we've been able to do. And twice a year, I host a conference in Key West, Florida, for 24 journalists to meet with 3 leading scholars of religion to help them better understand the role religion plays in the lives of Americans and also in the lives of people around the world. Now, you might say, why Key West, Florida? To get 24 prominent journalists to sit still for 2 days, you have to get out on an island. Why not Key West? You got to get them away from Washington or New York or Boston, and so we found a place in Key West, and we've been doing this since 1999. Now, what have we learned? Well, we have learned that, yes, many political reporters are biased, to say the least, but they're also largely uninformed, and they admit as much. After all, they have been educated at the elite universities of our dominant culture, which I previously mentioned. They often candidly admit that many religious believers of various traditions are simply a mystery to them. A mystery to them. And they're curious and want to understand them better. I'll give you another example. Nina Easton, who you would see sometimes now on Fox News, is the editor of Fortune magazine. But she used to write for the style page of the Washington Post. And I got to know Nina, and we went to... I'm sorry, excuse me, I got some ice. I went to lunch with Nina, and she said, I want to have lunch because I am going to go out to Missouri. I'm doing a story for the style page on John Ashcroft, the Attorney General at that time. And she says, I'm going to do a story not about his faith, but about his father's faith, and his grandfather's faith, and his great-grandfather. John Ashcroft, all of his father and his grandparents, they were all Assembly of God ministers. And they were charismatic and Pentecostal. So she said, I want you to explain to me American Pentecostalism. And I am going to spend 2 weeks in Missouri meeting a lot of these people and finding out about their faith. And I'm going to go to some Pentecostal churches. This is Washington Post style page writer. I said, Nina, I cannot prepare you enough for what one of those worship services will be like in Springfield, Missouri. Oh, she said, you know, I grew up Catholic. I'm okay. And so I gave her a book and some articles and essays on the history of American Assemblies of God and the Pentecostal movements, and she went up to Missouri, and she came back and wrote a very, very balanced story on John Ashcroft and the people who most influenced his life. But she did call me and say, can we have lunch again? And we did, and she said, you could not have prepared me. I went to worship, and I was frightened. I said, Nina, I think I said that to you. And I tried to encourage you, and that's why I told you to read those chapters. Now, many journalists know that it will help their reporting if in their work, if they better understood the world of religious believers in a religious community. And so we've had these conferences, and the response has been very encouraging. The conferences have received high praise from the reporters who have attended. Important content is conveyed to them, and our desire to provide them with the very best scholarship and resources available. Now, have we seen any tangible results from these efforts? Yes, actually we have, a lot. Please allow me to give you a couple of examples from the writings of the well-known New York Times columnist David Brooks. I could give you other examples. Why not pick examples from someone who's famous, who's been to our conferences? David has attended our conference 9 times, and he is very eager to learn more and more and more about these issues. We were in a bar in Key West at the conference some years ago, and I don't know how the subject came up, but I said something to David like, I said, we were talking about American evangelicals. He said, you know, I've been on the evangelical couple college campuses, and I really believe evangelicals are not the way they are portrayed in the press. You know, and he said, I said, well, David, I feel like the only person that in the evangelical community I know that take Pat Robertson so very seriously is the late Tim Russert. Tim Russert was alive then. I said, the only person that takes Pat Robertson seriously is Tim Russert and Meet the Press. Anytime I say, well, what do evangelicals bring? Bring in Pat Robertson. He said, that's been my experience as I've traveled around and been to colleges. I think that some of your figurehead leaders don't represent well what evangelicals believe in general. He said, I want to write about that someday. So he wrote a column in the New York Times, and some of you might have seen it, called Who is John Stott? Because he called me up on the phone, and he said, I just was at a conference in Florida, and I met some business people whose lives were changed by reading John Stott. He said to me, is John Stott important? I said, well, David, let me just say this. If evangelicals believed in a pope, and they had to pick one, they would probably pick John Stott. So you're on to the right person. He said, well, good, I'm going to write about him. I said, well, is this about politics and religion? And because if that's the case, you wouldn't want to go to John Stott for that. You might want to go to Francis Schaeffer. He said, well, no, I'm not writing about that. I'm writing about evangelicals as people and what they are like personally. And so he wrote his piece, and he called me up and said, can I email you my column before I submit it, because I want to see if I got this guy right. I read it, and I was so moved. I called him, I said, David, you never met the guy. And you read, it's like you've known him all your life. He said, well, I read none of his books. I said, what? And he started ticking them off, I read The Cross of Christ. I read his book on Galatians. I read this, and I tried to read that biography, the 2-volume biography. He said that was a little overly written. But he just crammed and read about Stott. And so here's some of what he said. He said, Tim Russert is a great journalist, but he made a mistake last weekend. He included Jerry Falwell and Al Sharpton in a discussion on religion and public life. Inviting these two on the Meet the Press to discuss this issue is like inviting Britney Spears and Larry Flint to discuss D.H. Lawrence. Naturally, they got into a demeaning food fight that would have lowered the intellectual discourse of your average nursery school. This is why so many people are so misinformed about evangelical Christians. There's a world of difference between the real-life people of faith and the made-for-TV Elmer Gantry type blowhards who are selected to represent them. Falwell and Robinson are held up as spokesmen for evangelicalism, which is ridiculous. Meanwhile, people like John Stott, who are actually important, get ignored. It could be, he says in the New York Times, it could be that you've never heard of John Stott. That's his next line. I don't blame you, he says. And then he goes down, and I'll skip down. He says, when you read Stott, you encounter, first of all, a tone of voice. Tom Wolfe once noticed that at a certain moment, all airline pilots came to speak like Chuck Yeager. The parallel is inexact, but over the years, I've heard hundreds of evangelicals who sound like John Stott. It is a voice that is friendly, courteous, and natural. It is humble and self-critical, but also confident, joyful, and optimistic. Stott's mission is to pierce through all the incrustations and share direct contact with Jesus. Stott says that the central message of the gospel is not the teachings of Jesus, but Jesus himself, the human divine figure. He is always bringing people back to the concrete reality of Jesus' life and sacrifice. Stott is so embracing, it's always a little bit of a shock, especially if you're a Jew like me, when you come across something on which he will not compromise. It's like being in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, except he has a backbone of steel. He does not accept homosexuality as a legitimate lifestyle, and of course he believes in evangelizing among non-believers. But most important, he does not believe that truth is plural. He does not believe in relativizing good and evil, or that all faiths are somehow something humans are working toward. Instead, he said, truth has been revealed. As John Stott writes, it is not because we are ultra-conservative or obscurantist or reactionary or the other horrid things which we are sometimes said to be. It is rather because we love Jesus Christ and because we are determined, God helping us, to bear witness to his unique glory and absolute sufficiency. In Christ, and the biblical witness to Christ's revelation is complete. To add any other words of our own to the finished work is derogatory to Christ. End of quote. Now here's the last paragraph. This was written in 2004. Politicians, especially Democrats, are now trying harder to appeal to people of faith. But people of faith are not just another interest group, like gun owners. You have to begin by understanding the faith. And you can't understand this rising global movement if you don't, first of all, meet its authentic representatives. Not Falwell, but Stott. End of quote. End of article. That's in the New York Times. Now, I read that. When he sent it to me, I said, David, you've known John Stott for like a week and a half. And I don't know anybody who could have said that any better. Or this from David after he attended our conference and we were talking about religion in the world and especially the growth of Pentecostalism in Africa. He made a trip to Africa and he wrote this column and he said it was called The Wisdom We Need to Fight AIDS. He said, there's a church in southern Mozambique that is about 10 yards long with a tin roof and walls made of sticks. Women gather there to sing and pray and look after the orphans of AIDS victims. They also talk about the consequences of unsafe sex. But after a while, they slip into another language of safety, slip out of the language of safety into a different language. They say, it's easier for those who have been touched by God to accept when a woman says no. They talk about praying for the man who beats his HIV-positive wife and trying to bring them into the congregation and into the church. In the week I spent traveling around southern Africa, I've been struck by how much technical knowledge we have brought to bear on combating AIDS. You give us a problem and we can solve it technically, like creating the medicines to treat disease, and we can perform mighty feats. The problem is that while treatment is a technical problem, prevention is not. Prevention is about changing behavior. We have tried to change behavior, but we have mostly tried technical means to prevent the spread of AIDS, and these techniques have proven necessary but insufficient. And then he goes on to talk about how we need to increase awareness and economic development. But then he says the AIDS crisis is about the sanctity of life. It's about people who have come to undervalue their own life and the ruinous behavior that seems unimportant to them and the death that follows from it. He said, in America, we read in the book of Job. In sub-Saharan Africa, they have 10 Jobs per acre. It is about these and a dozen other things: trust, fear, weakness, tradition, temptation, none of which can be addressed by externals. They can be addressed only by the language of ought, by fixing behavior into some relevant set of transcendent ideals and faiths. This week in Africa, I've been impressed by the level of medical expertise and depressed by the lack of moral, sociological, psychological, and cultural expertise. The most subtle analysis of human nature I heard came in that church made of sticks. End of article. Now, I just give you those examples to show you, David is an incredibly gifted guy, but he is an eager participant at our meetings because he says, as others have said, this is a world that too few of us in the mainstream elite media know so little about. And I would conclude simply with this. David wrote an important essay, again, if I might say, after one of our conferences called Kicking the Secularist Habit. It was in the Atlantic Monthly. And it was called Kicking the Secularist Habits. He wrote this. He said, like a lot of people these days, I'm a recovering secularist. Until September 11th, I accepted the notion that as the world becomes richer and better educated, it becomes less religious. This theory holds that as history moves forward, science replaces dogma, and reason replaces unthinking obedience. However, it is now clear that this secularization theory is untrue. The human race does not necessarily get less religious as it grows richer and better educated. We are living through one of the great periodic periods of scientific progress in the creation of wealth. At the same time, we are in the midst of a religious boom. Secularism is not the future. It is yesterday's incorrect vision of the future. This realization sends us recovering secularists to the bookstore, to the library, or even the conferences, I might add. That's a parenthesis. Send us to the bookstore or library in a desperate attempt to figure out what's going on in the world. I now get extremely annoyed at secular fundamentalists who are content to remain smugly ignorant of enormous shifts occurring all around them. They haven't learned anything about religion, at home or abroad. A great Niagara of religious fervor is cascading down around them while they stand obtuse and dry in their little cave of their own parochialism. And many of them are journalists and policy analysts who are paid to keep up with these things. He says we need to resist the impulse to find a materialistic explanation for everything. And then this is his last line. Understanding this world means beating the secular prejudices out of our minds every day. End of quote. Now, in conclusion, this is not bad advice for journalists working in Washington and New York or Chicago, but I suspect it's also not bad advice for all of us. Even for those of us who've grown up in Christian homes and Christian churches, learning to see our community, our country, and our world with fresh eyes means beating the secular prejudices out of our minds every day. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to entertain questions. Yes, ma'am.
Could you give us an idea of some of the scholars,
yes.
thinkers that come to your conferences?
Yes, I'm glad to. I have 8 journalist advisors to the project, and we meet twice a year, and we have lunch, and we say, what are the issues you want to talk about at the next conference? Because we want them to own the project also, and not just Michael Cromartie putting his speakers on them. We discuss topics and speakers. One of them said, this was right at the beginning of President Bush's administration. He said, we want to understand President Bush's faith. We want to know more about evangelicalism. So I was able to get Professor Mark Knoll from Wheaton College, who gave a wonderful talk entitled Understanding American Evangelicalism. At another meeting, they said, we understand megachurches. What's a megachurch? I was able, through the help of my good friend Peb, to get Rick Warren to come. And Mr. Megachurch. And by the way, the transcript of that being read on pewforum.org is really, really lively. Real lively. I mean, animated. At one point, we really talk about religion and its public policy implications, but at one point, several of the journalists really wanted to know who was and who was not going to hell. And this got a little tense, as you can imagine. And at one point, I finally had to say, as the moderator, I said, discussions about eternal destination will be best held over cocktails at the reception that will soon follow. Should we move on? And that's actually in the transcript. But we've had Professor Philip Jenkins twice, who, has written very important books on the explosion of Christianity around the world and the two-thirds world. We've had, in the primaries, we had the leading scholar on Mormonism in America to talk about Mormonism. We've had experts on Islam and terrorism and about the expansion of Islam in the Middle East. We've had scholars on bioethics. Gilbert Mylander spoke on bioethical issues. We've had James Hunter to talk about culture wars. We actually had a debate between James Hunter and Alan Wolf entitled, Is There a Culture War? And they didn't agree, which was fun in moderating that. We've had, we try to tie the subject to something that's in the news. And that we're having another conference this December, and we had one of these luncheons last week. And we're trying to do one of the things will be we have 2 leading political demographers and political scientists to look at. We will look 1 month after the election at how religious people voted in the election, and they'll have all the data, and we'll be able to see what Catholics, whether Catholics voted for which ticket, and how evangelicals voted. But one of the dilemmas we have is this election being so close. One of the topics we want to look at is understanding American Pentecostalism, and I would love very much to get someone like Grant Wacker, who's the leading scholar on that in America, to come. But I can't sort of say, I might have to say, Grant, we want you to come if the McCain-Palin ticket wins. But if they don't, I have to disinvite you because we may need to do one on understanding the black church and American religion. And since we can't tell who's going to win, there's a little dilemma there because we want to have the topic tie into what people are thinking about. If McCain-Palin lose, you can't, a month later, let's talk about American Pentecostalism because that subject will have moved on. So that's one of our dilemmas. But what we try to do, ma'am, is to connect the scholars with the subject that's in the news of the moment so that what they're covering helps them do their job better. Thank you. Yes, sir. And then over here next. Here and then here.
Do you find any tendency of the cultural elites learn something about religion, to turn to the liberal Protestants, we are United Methodists fighting the battle within our own denomination, whether it's going to become a faithful Christian church again or a culture-conforming church, which is the tendency. Either in the mainline denominations, those who will revise everything to be culturally acceptable, or the current religious left people like Jim Wallace. In other words, those people maybe seem more attractive to some of the folks you're working with because they're a little closer to them.
And so the question is, do they
tend to go that direction rather than really trying to connect with evangelical Christians?
Yes. No, I see what you're saying. And I've had to say it several times. And I think I can say this on the record. I know Jim Wallace. But I'll get a call and they'll say, well, Rick Warren thinks this and Jim Wallace thinks that. And I'll say, Rick Warren has a church of 25,000 people. His book has sold $25 million copies. Jim Wallace doesn't have a church. And you all keep making these equivalencies between, as if, as the New York Times reporter said at our last meeting, David Kirkpatrick, he says, no, I'm sorry, but are there anybody else out there other than Ron Sider, Tony Campolo, and Jim Wallace? That's all I've heard for 30 years, he said. And this is a New York Times reporter saying, are there anybody else? Well, there are new names now. But the point is, the growing end of American Protestantism is not progressive religion, but it's conservative evangelicalism that churches are booming. And the tendency in the press is oftentimes to mix up those numbers and say, well, there's one group over here, and I want to remind them. I say, yes, I know those voices, but they're not the same size. Rick Warren did a very important thing with the Saddleback meeting. A lot of articles in the New Yorker magazine. Francis Fitzgerald wrote this piece, as all you all know, that because of Rick's wonderful work, the evangelical agenda is expanding. And we're concerned about Africa and about AIDS in Africa and about sexual trafficking, about religious persecution. That's all true. Now, someone like Francis Fitzgerald in the New Yorker will write that the evangelical agenda has changed. And they're all progressives now. And Rick said this, and I've said this many times to the press. It has expanded, but they haven't abandoned the earlier moral, social, and cultural issues. And then Rick said that too after the Saddleback thing. And then I just, there are people like Francis Fitzgerald who think that because evangelicals care about the environment, they don't care about these things anymore. Well, that's simply not the case. And by the way, all the polling data shows this. The polling data. Again, I'm not trying to make a partisan point. I'm just trying to make a point. Thank you for your provocative question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned some very good examples of apparent influence on the conferences. I'm sure you've tracked to see what's been being written by the people that have attended your conferences.
Yes.
Are you seeing some opening of minds and some change?
Oh, absolutely. For instance, the cover story in Time magazine of Rick Warren that some of you may have seen. David Von Beam has been 6 times. We talked for an hour about Rick on the phone when he was writing that piece. Literally an hour. Because when he called me, he said, "Do you have time?" I said, "Well, how much time?" He said, "Well, about an hour." I said, "Oh, well, call me tomorrow." But David Von Beam, who wrote that piece, did you all see that piece? It was wonderfully balanced, I have to say. And he wanted to get at, who is this man? And what is this movement? And what's going on here? So there's one example. There are other examples of people who will, Jeffrey Goldberg at the Atlantic Monthly does this very well. David Shribman of the Pittsburgh newspaper does this very well. Carl Cannon now at Reader's Digest. Kathleen Parker, the columnist, has been about 6 times, and they know that there's this phenomenon in America of religious explosion, and that they want to know who the best sources are to talk about it. So you get there are examples of people who really want to try to get it right, even if they don't agree with the faith of the people. They want to get it right, and I'm very encouraged by that. Yes, ma'am.
That's a quick question. So in regards to, this is more of a personal issue, or with the personal relationship.
Yes.
The journalist David, who wrote those have you seen or noticed any change in his heart as far as since he's been investigating this?
No, only in the sense that, let me repeat the question. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Thank you for asking. The question was, on a personal level, have you seen a change of heart of anybody, for instance, like David Brooks? David, who is a devout Jew, who's read all of John Stott's works now, have I seen a change of heart? Only in the sense that David has got deep respect for people of faith, and but at the same. After he wrote the John Stott piece, which came out in November '04, we had a conference in December, and I'll never forget. My friend Carl Cannon used to be at the National Journal, now at Reader's Digest. They were all around, standing around this bar in Key West, talking about David's piece on John Stott. And Carl Cannon said to him, and I don't mind this going into the CD tape, David, you're going to become a Christian. You're going to become a Christian, aren't you? And he looked and said, probably not. 2 reasons. Number 1, my wife would kill me. And number 2, I still have some reservations about the divinity of Jesus. But he was honest about it. And then, here's a great story about the Stott piece, was he then had breakfast with John Stott when he came to Washington. And another story about the John Stott piece, a wonderful story, is David Brooks gets a phone call from the personal assistant of singer-songwriter Paul Simon. Paul Simon had read his piece on John Stott, and his assistant in New York called and said, Paul Simon loved your piece on this man named John Stott. He wants to meet John Stott. And David said, okay, where's Paul? He said, well, Paul's over in London right now. And David said, well, that's where John Stott is. He said, well, can he meet him? And David said, I don't know the man. Call him. Just like you called me. So he calls John Stott. And Paul Simon says, Dr. Stott, I want to meet you. I'm at, what's the most famous hotel in London? Claridge's? Come, let me give you dinner at Claridge's. And Stott says, no, why don't you just come over to my flat? Now, I don't know if you all know John Stott, but he's like Francis of Assisi. I mean, he has a 2-bedroom flat, smaller than this room. And he says, come over and have tea with me. Paul Simon gets in a cab and goes over and spends 3 hours with John Stott. Because of that article. The first thing he said to John Stott, well, the first 20, 30 minutes, he just railed about the religious right and how much he didn't like them. But he'd read about him and thought he sounded like a wonderful human being. About 20 minutes into this rant, I got this story from a friend of mine who was on the board of John Stott's ministries. But John Stott interrupted him. He says, Paul, it's very lovely to meet you. But I must say, I didn't think you wanted to come over and talk to me about America's religious right. I think you probably want to talk to me about the person of Jesus Christ. Let's go there. So he just turned the discussion around. Now, I don't know what the results of that are, but this is how ideas have consequences, by the way. Somebody hears about something, reads the person, writes a beautiful article, and then the ricochet effect. It's beautiful. So that's some personal stuff. Other personal anecdotes, just that I know that some of these journalists have, in the midst of looking at this subject academically and professionally, have also stopped and reflected and read A Purpose-Driven Life and met Rick Warren personally and are now friends with him. I know Rick keeps in touch with them. And they've gone out and interviewed him during the Saddleback time. Peb would want to know, Carl Cannon had 30, 45 minutes with Rick. He's going to do a cover story in Reader's Digest because he came out to Saddleback and spent time with Rick. And let me just say for the record that for all of us in this room who believe in the power and the work of the Holy Spirit, I'll leave that up to the Holy Spirit. But try to remain friends and available to people. If it ever became the case that people thought Cromartie is having meetings in Florida to proselytize, no one would show up. So the purpose is to help serve. By the way, I think one of the reasons it's going well is that they also know that we're trying to serve them. That the purpose of this is to help you do your job so you can get it right. And I think they know that. And the quotes and comments that we have back from them say that. This helps me do my work better. And so that's very... Yes, sir, and then you. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on what appears to be a bias or maybe hypocrisy in their... Helen has a 17-year-old daughter who's pregnant, but doesn't Biden also have a teenage daughter who's pregnant?
I'm not aware of that.
Well, I heard it on the news, and his comment was, "You leave my family out of this issue."
Yeah.
And but they don't seem to do that with Helen. And also the issue of her not aborting a child with Down syndrome. Well, could you comment on the impact of the media on dealing with those issues?
Yeah, well, as I would say, those of you who came in later, my first anecdotes at the beginning were, these phone calls I received, which very respectable people in the press who had thought that the press release that went out about Bristol would end the McCain candidacy. It was over. And I said, it's not over. In fact, his esteem for him went up when he didn't make it disqualifying. In fact, I said to one of them, I said, do you understand what would have happened if during the vetting process one of the aides came in and said, "Senator, we have some news. The daughter's pregnant." And he said, "Oh, okay, bring in Romney." No, the fact that he did make it disqualifying is what really has moved a lot of people. But now to your question of well, we've all been watching the news the last couple of weeks, and I said at the luncheon last week privately to one of these people, the work of these conferences is all the more urgent because the inability to get this right is so obvious in so many ways. The way that people have talked about. I was at a meeting last week with journalists at a luncheon where one of them said, "Okay, we've heard all about Reverend Wright. Now, when are we going to hear about her pastor?" And one of the scholars said, "Well, I think there's a difference here. I don't need to repeat for you what Reverend Wright was saying, but her pastor, he did say some things about Israel and how much he loved Israel. And he does believe in the rapture because evangelicals do have a certain take on the second coming. That's what he said to Eleanor Cliff of Newsweek. You can't quite make these things the same." Anyway, Peb, did you have your hand up? Yeah. On this point? No. Okay, then this gentleman here, and then you're next. Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you invite just journalists to your conferences, or do you also have representatives from the entertainment industry? Or would you consider inviting folks from the entertainment industry?
Well, the purpose is to get print and broadcast media, and so we have people from NBC and CBS and ABC and National Public Radio, and then we have writers from Newsweek and Time and U.S. News and World Report and the Weekly Standard and the New Republic and the New Yorker and Atlantic Monthly. But no, we haven't done this for the entertainment industry. And what we could do is invite somebody who covers the entertainment industry. That would work. So if you know people in the press that you think should be invited to these things, probably let me know. We invite certain people back continually, and then we try to bring in new people. And we keep it at 24. By the way, if you want to read the transcripts of these, and they're all up online, it's at pewforum.org. Pew, P-E-W. Pew Forum, F-O-R-U-M, at pewforum.org. Pew Forum is, I'm the convener of the conferences. Pew Forum helps pay for them. And they're on their website. You go under transcripts, and you can see all these discussions there. And I warn you, when you print them out, however, they do come out to about 38 or 40 pages. That's the only complaint I've had of the transcripts. They're awfully long. So it was a 2.5-hour discussion. Pip?
Most of us here are interested in effective organizations and effective movements that create change. And I'm an unabashed enthusiast for Michael and what he does. We might be interested in knowing how you're structured. How are you funded? And might be appropriate to bring that up. Would you like to do
Well, that's very kind of you, brother. That was not a plant. But I can handle it. No, that's very kind, Peb. I had a grant from the Pew Foundation, and I ran this through my think tank called the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and we did this for many years. And then Pew Foundation put together their own think tank in Washington called the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. And the director of the Pew Forum came to me and said, "Michael, we want you to keep running these conferences but they're now going to become our conferences, not Ethics and Public Policy Center conferences. But we want you to be a senior advisor to the Pew Forum, run the conferences, but they're going to have our brand. So the Pew Forum pays for the expenses of all the journalists and pays all the costs for 2 days. And then they pay just part of my salary. And then my work with the journalist that's not covered from the Pew Forum is supported by good friends like you. So if you'd like my card afterwards, I'd be glad to give it to you. But no, the point is that the Pew Forum covers the cost of the conferences and part of my salary, and then my work with the media, which is, I just have to say, I've developed a lot of relationships. I'm constantly getting calls now about Pentecostalism and about Sarah Palin. Because of these relationships, I was on the Jim Lehrer News Hour to talk about the Reverend Jeremiah Wright issue. And because a week after his Philadelphia speech, they want to know, this is over now, right? This is over. I said, no, it's not over. It's not over. But anyway, all that to say that, did I do it, Peb? Did that sort of get to what you're asking?
My other point, and I don't want to dominate this by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's great to see these consequential opportunities here, and for a few bucks, this guy is one of the most effective returns on investment in our. I think his budget probably is like $150,000 and needs 70 or 80. He doesn't even have a secretary, and he's making these big changes. I'd love to see this.
Pep, I'd love for you to just come on up here and just stand right here.
If he wasn't a fan, you should have planted him.
Pep's talking that way because he's been to their conferences twice and brought Rick. The wonderful providential thing about I'll just tell this story, Pep, is they're on. So we want to know what a megachurch is, and I said, well, what if we got Rick Warren? They said, well, that would do. And so I called Peb, and I said, Peb, I know it's only 2.5 months out, but could Rick come to Key West to do on our journalist conference? Peb said, I'll get back to you. He called me back and said, Rick, that night, the beginning of the conference, that night is speaking at a dinner in Key Largo. So we'll come over right after he speaks. And then Rick spent, 2 days with us there. It was a great blessing. So Peb is speaking that way because Peb has actually been. Ralph, you're next, and then I think, did you have your hand up? Ralph?
Just a quick comment and a question.
Are you going to do Peb's speech?
I advise a family foundation that supports Michael's work, so we've done all our due diligence. If you want to, I need the numbers to see me, but his budget is really modest, and Pew funds 1/3 of it. But we get to go as an observer, as a funder, and like Peb, I think it's one of the most extraordinary conversations in public square that I've ever been to. So I endorse you again. But my question is this: would you mind?
Thank you, Ralph. Go ahead. Keep going.
When I was down there, David Bush was telling us about his meeting with Scott. Can you go on record and describe that conversation?
Yes. What happened was that David called me and said, Paul Simon just went and met with John Stott, and I said, well, it's the time you met with John Stott, and he said, I'd love to meet John Stott. So anyway, John was in Washington, and they had a 2.5-hour, 3-hour breakfast together, and I think the parts I remember about it, Ralph, was simply that. I know what so impressed David about John Stott was he said, people come into this town constantly. And he said, here we are at the Hay Adams, looking out over toward the White House, and all they want to do is talk about Washington politics. And he said, all John Stott wanted to do was talk about the gospel. Now that's David. That's a quote. He said, and I think Ralph, you'll remember this. He said, he wanted me to become part of the team. Come on over to our side, his side. And we had a good talk, he said, about that. So, John was probably pretty straightforward with him. And David, the way David put it was he wanted me to join the team. And we had a good conversation. So, Yeah, that's right. He said most people come to this town, they want to talk about politics, and all Stott wanted to do was talk about Jesus. So, look, let me tell you someone else who's been to these meetings, and then I'll get to these other questions. Twice. Christopher Hitchens has been to Key West. Now, the notorious best-selling atheist author, Christopher Hitchens, he's been twice. Now, you'd say to Christopher, why? He said, I know this subject's important. Now, how did I get him there? Well, I had him be a respondent. He was a respondent. And I think that's how we got him. But we had a good time, and I've gotten to know Christopher as a result. And we have a real friendship. And every time I'm with him, he wants to talk about religion, about faith. Every time. I said to him once, "Methinks thou protest too much." He said, No, I'm just doing research. Just doing research. This gentleman here, and then you. Yes, sir.
I appreciate your comments. A few of us are here from Canada, and there is a federal election going on right now in Canada.
Oh, is there?
The Prime Minister, with a big piece of real estate north of Michigan. The Prime Minister is a Christian, but religion and politics it's non-existent up there. I mean, it'll be mentioned, and it just disappears. I mean, there's not any debate at all about one's faith or family or conduct or what all in Canada at all. It's just off the radar, at least of all Christianity. Do you have any impressions, contacts, or contact the media in Canadian politics as far as Christianity and their writings?
No, not really. And I take it, but one of the reasons it's not really on the radar scene is, look, here's why it's on the radar screen here. Out of nowhere, religion and politics have always been intertwined in American history, American life. And then out of nowhere, millions and millions and millions of people, heretofore not involved politically, helped elect Ronald Reagan the President of the United States. And everybody said, what are these people doing? We thought they were apolitical. I'm talking about American fundamentalism and then evangelicalism. But it was the awakening of the fundamentalist sleeping giant that caused a lot of media attention to politics. And I don't think you have the equivalent of that in Canada. And so that's why it's such, and then after that, and then of course now post 9/11 with radical Islam. I mean, as Martin Marty says, is there any non-religious news in the news today? Everywhere you turn, it's a religious story. And you've got to know these topics. But I think just the difference for Canada is simply you have a different dynamic there politically, sociologically, and religiously. Yes, ma'am. And then this gentleman over here. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if it was possible to have your conference in October instead of December. I hear all these journalists on television say this is the most exciting election that they can remember. It's been a long time.
Thank you. No, but the truth of the matter is, we are going to have a luncheon, if Peb Jackson can help me work it out. I've corresponded with Rick Warren and said, Rick, you come to Washington, let me know. We'll have a luncheon. We can get 25 journalists there, and the top ones, and they're obviously curious about you. And we can do things in Washington before the election. Again, the purpose of those things is just to inform people and catch them up to date. One of the things that I'm happy about is that, we all know about media bias, but I am happy to see there are really journalists who take their job seriously, and when they get the information, they will do it right. You go to Newsweek.com, and Eleanor Cliff came to this luncheon last week and wrote about why evangelicals found Sarah Palin appealing. Now, Eleanor Cliff is politically very liberal, a Newsweek writer, and you read that piece and you say, I don't see the bias in there. Because she came to that luncheon, she heard these political scientists, and then she liked my story. I did tell them the story about the difference between evangelical and fundamentalist, and the whole thing about Billy Graham, and fundamentalists think Billy Graham's a liberal, and she put that in there. But, also she began this thing by, I recounted the story to that whole group about the reaction of some of the colleagues when they called me about Bristol Palin. They all thought that the McCain campaign was over. Both of them did. That, this was going to just torpedo it. And I said, quite the opposite. And so then, when I told her, she puts that right in there and she says, there's a sentiment growing in the country that whatever you think about Governor Palin, there's a resonation with religious people toward her that's unique and interesting. And so she wrote about it at Newsweek.com. You can get it. Eleanor Cliff. Were you here, sir? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have seen any kind of change in the younger journalists' views on religion and politics.
One of the best writers for the New York Times is Michael Luo, L-U-O. It's been twice. Michael is an evangelical. He's the evangelical at the New York Times. I don't know if he wants everybody to know that, but no, actually, they know that at the time because he went to them with stories. He said, there's a story here, and they go, how'd you know that? Again, there's inhabiting two worlds. And Michael used to attend Tim Keller's church, and now he covers politics in the New York Times. And he's written some really good articles. When Hillary Clinton was a candidate, he wrote about Hillary Clinton's faith and tried to explicate it for the readers of the New York Times. So, but not other than that, I don't have any thing to say. Nothing more to say about that. Yes, sir.
You've talked a lot about print journalism. I'm wondering if you'd comment a little on blogging and where you see that fitting.
Yeah, we haven't had any bloggers yet, and of course that would really open up because there's a few out there you may have not heard. But some have suggested, there's some good bloggers whose pages are well read, and they are really journalists. And we're going to have to decide what to do with that because we have print and we have broadcast people from National Public Radio and the major networks. But we've never had a blogger, and that is something we need to consider. Yes, ma'am.
Would you consider doing the same thing you've done with the lead journalists with the Hollywood producers for us all?
Well, it's a good idea. It's a great idea, and it's clearly the two worlds that I just described are those different worlds, and that's a great idea. Need it as much or more than journalists, right? Yes, ma'am.
You hit a hot button with me, and I suspect with many that anytime there seems to be a natural disaster or a political story or anything in the world huge, Jerry Falwell or Al Sharpton gets to speak for me. And that is such a frustration for me.
Of course it is.
I'm so excited that Rick Warren has become more front and center. Personally, I am. And I wonder why more folks, more pastors, I belong to a mega church in Atlanta, why we don't see more of those faces up front is because the media don't ask them or because they say no, they don't want to be exposed the way Rick has allowed himself to be.
Well, let's be candid. I mean, Rick's written the best-selling book in the history of American publishing. That will get a little bit of attention. Again, to just say something about these two worlds, and one of my speakers, I won't mention his name, came to Key West, is an expert on the Middle East, one of the best scholars in America on the subject, came to Key West and had never heard of Rick Warren. And Rick was there. He said, I didn't know who this guy was. And I said, well, you do read the bestseller list, don't you? Yeah, but I'd not read that. Now, why that, I think that the reason Rick is getting the attention is obvious. And why others may not be, I think they're going to have to. What's really sad is that when pastors say something flamboyant and really bad, they get attention. And they say something absurd, like comments made after 9/11 by Reverend Wright on the left and Dr. Falwell on the right that were really unfortunate. So theologically incorrect to ever say what they said. And I say that unabashedly. But I just think that people get attention if your church is quite large, and you've. I think obviously churches in Wasilla are getting a lot of attention right now, or in Juneau. And journalists have to keep up with what people are curious about and what's getting attention. What I'd like is that when they get there and they have their pad out, that they actually know something, that they're not landing on another planet. But many of them are. They literally have just dropped in from another planet and they want to scribble. And what we're trying to do is give them information so that when they go there, like Nina Easton did when she went out to Springfield, Missouri. She went with articles, and I tried to warn her. But some of those churches kind of got her attention. Yes. I saw a hand. Yes, ma'am, and then you, sir.
It sounds like you credit a lot of the success of the forum that you're doing with the fact that the journalists have a sincere desire to learn
and not all of them.
I wonder if in light of that, I have a perception of Hollywood producers that may not be on their highest list of values.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder what the true opportunity is to have to talk with them candidly, or if there's too much of a desire to create a story and not have that same credible.
No, that's a very good point. It might be harder to get the hook. This is a hook because this is in the news and this is what they need to know, and it might be harder to get the hook to convince a producer why you need to know about these people or about this topic. It might be a little hard, but if we can figure out the hook, we'll try to make it work. Yes, sir.
I'm a Canadian, as is Barry, so I'm not well informed about.
Welcome to America.
My question is just, I assume you're a political appointment by the Bush administration. If Obama wins, what happens to the things you set up?
Oh no! Oh yeah. My appointment was to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom by President Bush, and that'll go on until it runs out. I was just reappointed last month, and that has nothing to do with the election. It won't. And by the way, let me just add to that point, because we are a real diverse group of people when we have these meetings, politically, in every way. We purposely make it diverse, and I think these journalists know the think tank that I work for, and they know very much that it's right of center. But I'm grateful to say that they also know, and have said to our evaluators of the program, and we've had some outside evaluators, and I was grateful to read the quotes from some of them that said, we know Michael is not trying to ram a political ideology or a religion down our throat. And so I'm happy about that. I thought your question was going to be, if you've been appointed by the Bush administration, do they not think that you are going to be skewing things? And the purpose of having these 8 journalist advisors, these 2 luncheons twice a year, is to give cover to the question of trying to push an agenda. And in that mix, David Brooks is a part of that group, and some people from the Washington Post and the New Yorker magazine and the Atlantic Monthly. It's a conversation about what would be best to serve you. And they know that we're not pushing an agenda. I am worried about our December meeting in this sense. You all may have noticed this is a pretty tense election. And there are some of my friends that if Senator Obama doesn't win, are going to jump in the Potomac River. I mean, there's a real tension there. And there could be some real hard feelings, even a month after the election. And I'm a little concerned about, if it's a close election, it comes down to one state. I am a little concerned about how relaxed people are going to be. There's some real strong feelings on both sides. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You're.
Can you comment on the role or the lack of civility in the political sphere? Specifically, I thought it was interesting. I think the first joint appearance between both presidential candidates was at Saddleback.
Yes, it was.
By Rick Warren. And if I remember correctly, the title was A Civil Forum on Leadership. It seems to me, if I remember correctly, there's only 3 presidential debates. When you take the 2 gentlemen and put them on stage together and they're out there together, it seems to me that there's a forced sense of civility as opposed to the 30-second or 60-second attack ad, which is so prevalent right now. Is there anything that we can do to get back to that sense of civility in our elections and really talk about the issues as opposed to pit bulls and lipstick?
Well, we can just keep talking about it. And the example that Rick exhibited there was a wonderful example of how this ought to happen. I do think we have a problem in light of the new technology of getting the word out. That civility, we must always preach and work for civility. But, there are people on the extreme left right now that are just being outrageous in the media. And some of the rumors that were flying around early after Governor Palin's prediction was just appalling. And these things seem to be heightened because of the quickness and the rapidity of the way we get news out now. And there's hardly a way to contain it. This is going to be done on the right and the left. the feelings are so strong and intense. All I can say is that we just at least got to ask our candidates to be that way, and to try to ask their staff to be that way. Oftentimes, when the Obama campaign or the McCain campaign are being accused of nasty tactics, the tactics are not by them. It's by people who are their supporters. And that distinction is not often made. I saw a hand over here. I'll take this one.
What exactly, with Obama, I read a lot about his heritage and his religious background and the church he was in now. What exactly does Obama believe about faith, about Muslims? Where does he stand in mixing it with politics? What does he profess that he is, or?
All I would simply say is I just take him at his word on that. That he did have a religious conversion experience. That he did. What's been difficult for him, as you all well know, and will continue to be, is that the person who led him to faith, who married him, who baptized his children, has been a big dilemma for him now, and that is Reverend Jeremiah Wright. As you know, all the commentators say, we understand that you're a professing Christian, and we will have to trust you on that. And you sat in this church for 20 years, and you never heard any of this stuff before. So that's where it's difficult for him now to break from that and to clarify. But I'll take. Look, the reason why he's such a formidable candidate is the Democratic Party has learned something very important. We can't. I'll pretend to be a Democratic consultant for a moment. We can't keep putting forward people who are tone deaf toward religious people. We can't keep being the secular party. I mean, the advisors 3 months out in the 2004 election went to Kerry and said, "You got to say something about your faith." And I never forget in that debate. I was an altar boy. Remember that? And it was like 2 months out. And all the data, all the empirical data says, unfortunately for the Democratic Party, is perceived as the secular party. And so, immediately going into 2008, Hillary Clinton had a faith advisor. Barack Obama had a faith advisor. Everybody has a faith advisor. Why? Because they had seen the same data. We can't keep presenting ourselves as a secular party. And so that's why Hillary Clinton hired a faith advisor. That's why Senator Obama has one now. And that's why he's such a formidable candidate, because he speaks about it so well. And then the Jeremiah Wright thing is just a big wrench that came out of nowhere. And it really kind of muddied what was smooth sailing up to that point. Is that helpful? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
That's a silly question. Where does CNN, Fox, TV network, where does that fall in journalism since it's not print?
No, we have people from CNN and Fox. We try with CNN to get the producers of the shows to come, because they're the real power. They're the ones who tell Anderson Cooper who to call and what to do, and so we've had the producer of Anderson Cooper's show twice. We've had a couple people from Fox, but CNN, NBC. We try to get print and broadcast media there, and. Dan Harris from ABC News has been a couple of times. Barbara Bradley Haggerty from NPR comes almost every time. So we try to be as diverse as possible, and we try to think strategically also about who can come and who to invite back, and we don't let them know how strategic we're thinking, but we do it. Yes, sir. Yes, we do some, but as you may well know, that the smaller markets get their news from the larger markets. And what's on the cover of the New York Times this morning will be on the Evening News tonight. And what's on the cover of the Washington Post today will be the lead story tonight. And so, we've had people from the Charlotte paper and from Atlanta, but we mainly shoot for the elite media self-consciously. And we're limited in our seating. I mean, we don't have 50 people. We have 24. Which, by the way, just makes, and Pev has been, Ralph has been, for anybody who has been, it makes for such a rich conversation. Because You get what's really stimulating is you get really good academics with really smart journalists going back and forth, and it's really a rich discussion. And the academics are thrilled by it because, they're so used to talking to students who don't want to hear them. And they get with really smart journalists.
The perception that the elite media, or a lot of them, are more openly backing one candidate in this presidential election, even more than they have in the past. And if that is the case, why?
No comment. No, I think it seems pretty obvious. Why? There could be a dozen reasons why. And so I don't want to go there. I would get off on some kind of tangent, and I'm trying to be neutral. Thank you for asking again another provocative question. I love your questions. You're trying to get me out there, and I'm not going to. I saw a hand somewhere. I see that hand. Yes, sir.
Does the media bias, does it come from the individual's worldview, or is it from lack of good information?
Well, I think all those things are happening. I think it comes from worldview and lack of information, but also I think that it is simply the case. And as I gave you the example at the beginning, that there is the person who called me from National Public Radio, they are in a bubble. And they're all in that, and I've been over to those offices, and I've been on that program, and they're all in there. And they're talking to each other. They're like a beehive. And they're just in the war. And there's no one else around to correct them. Okay, I'll call Michael. Hey, Michael, guess what? It's over, isn't it? I said, what'd you say? It's over. I mean, the daughter's pregnant. I said, I don't think that's what you want to say. Really? I just got off the phone with a professor down at Belmont University. He said it's over. I said, he's biased. I didn't say that. No, I said, and they really were like, this is big, isn't it? And I said, yeah, but in the other direction. And so that is part of being a part. There's no self-correcting mechanism in that newsroom. And the woman who called me from Newsweek, same thing. Up and down the hall, there's a buzz. And she said to me on the phone, now, Michael, you know I'm Jewish. I said, yes, I do. She said, when I cover these stories and I see something like this happen, I say to myself, now, I pretend they're Jewish. And I say, is this good for the Jews? I'm asking you now, is this good for the evangelicals? I said, have you ever heard of a crisis pregnancy center? Mega churches are full of them. Life does happen. And I want you to know that the message, evangelicalism, properly understood, is about grace, forgiveness, redemption, and healing. And why this is resonating with people is that they know people like Bristol, and they've had to take them in. It is true that early 1950s fundamentalism would have said, send her off to the relatives. Hide her. But in this case, people have experienced this, and people are getting a chilling effect knowing that this family is enfolding them. I was so deeply moved, and again, I'm trying not to make partisan points here, when Levi arrived from Alaska and Senator McCain greeted him on the tarmac. That's the future husband. Now, I was just moved by that. Embraced him. And so I said to this reporter, hey, let me get this, I want you to get this right. Redemption, healing. We are broken people. We're flawed. We need grace. This is what evangelicals believe. Now, I'm a conservative Protestant evangelical myself. They don't always know that. So I love being in the role of being the objective observer. Let me tell you what evangelicals believe. They believe in grace, forgiveness. We're flawed. We need a redeemer. That's what they believe. Now, it is true that the public face of American evangelicalism and the wonderful ministry that Rick Warren has, is that he's helped change the public face of American evangelicalism. I think the reason their reaction to her pregnancy is that they confused not only 1950s fundamentalism, but they confused 1980s fundamentalism with the public face of American evangelicalism. And they said, This is not going to go down well in Lynchburg, Virginia, is it? And again, I said to her, go online and look at what Dr. Dobson just said about this. He's already got a statement out. It's about healing and forgiveness and redemption and moving on and correcting life's mistakes. So I do get a chance to preach every now and then. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to do that. What the results may be on a personal level, one doesn't know. And I did we have about 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and I'll get your question in. But a reporter from Newsweek, another reporter, Susanna Meadows, called me about a year ago, and Senator Vitter from Louisiana had been involved in a sexual scandal, and she called me and said, the same thing, this is this is terrible for evangelicals. This is terrible. And so we did an interview. And I made these points about people are flawed and they need a redeemer and there's forgiveness and there's grace and there's healing. And her next line in the interview is, wow, no wonder so many people are becoming evangelicals. And you know what I said in the next line? That's why it's called good news. It's good news. It's not bad news. It's good news. And so that's on the transcript. So I was delighted by that. You can also read that on Newsweek.com. Susanna Meadows. It's called the Vitter effect. Vitter effect. Anyway, so look, on a personal level, pray for me. Please. Because there's opportunities like this are coming in ways that I could never. Oftentimes I'll say, why me? So, I'll try to be faithful there. Yes, ma'am. Thanks for coming. Yeah, well, they have a couple of religion reporters. Rachel Zoll is an excellent reporter. Eric Gortsky is an excellent reporter. They try to stay on top of the news. The worst quote I ever had, and again, here's another thing. I'm grateful that when I go rambling on with some of these people, they actually pull out the best thing I said. It makes me seem a lot smarter than I am. But they actually pull it. But the worst one I ever had was, bless her heart, and she apologized for it. Rachel Zoll called me, and I was at a conference in Orlando, and I went back to my room, and my cell phone rang. She said, you heard the news out of Colorado. I said, what news? And what is his name? The head of NAE. The sad story there. Say his name again. You heard about Ted Haggard? And I said, no. She said, well, what do you think? She told me what had happened. I said, can you give me a quote? And I said, I'm just so sad to hear this. It's a terrible story. Well, can you say something for me? I said, nothing more than this is tragic. Well, do you want to say something on the record? No, I'm trying to get over it. And she said, well, he said he didn't do it. This is all politically motivated, and it's not true. Whereupon I said, if that's the case, then one can only hope and pray that he's restored to the ministry and remains the head of the NAE. She said, can I quote you? I said, sure. Boom. Goes out on the wire the next morning. He comes out and confesses that it all happened. But Michael Cromartie, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, said, one can only hope and pray he's restored to the ministry and the head of the NAE. I must have got a dozen emails saying, he's guilty. And I wrote back, yeah, he just confessed it. I didn't know it when I said it. And I called her. I got to the airport and I called her and I said, you got that quote down? She said, oh, yeah, we took it down, but it stayed up somewhere. So, yeah, that's the only time it's happened. And, God bless Ted Haggard. But, this was a person fishing for a quote, and I was trying to get over the tragedy of the thing. Anyway, I think you're very kind to have stayed the whole time. I think aren't we supposed to end at 2 or 12? Thank you for coming.